I rise to speak in support of the motion that to stop growing inequity, Africa must first heal its past in this inaugural AU Afro Champions debate series in celebration of continental unity on the occasion of Africa Integration Week. I assert that Africa's past has bequeathed structures of oppression that are seen in inequities of class, gender, race, and age, and are evident in divides between urban and rural areas, between suburbs and urban slums, and in the stridently partisan politics that characterize the zero-sum game nature of politics in Africa. From the early years of Africa's independence, Africans have debated how to deal with the past. This debate has been animated partly by the impact the outside world, that is, the Western world, has had on Africa's past, and the desire to close this page and move on. Slavery in Africa and the export slave trade from Africa happened in another age. Colonialism ended largely in the 1960s and 1970s. African countries have celebrated their golden anniversaries of independence. Why can't we move on? I begin my reflections with insights from some of Africa's leading scholars to underscore how the past is very much a part of our present, shapes our present, and our capacity to forge a peaceful and prosperous future. One of the earliest salvos in this debate was fired by Walter Rodney, the West Indian historian who taught in the late 1960s and early 1970s at the University of Dar es Salaam, then a stronghold of African socialism. Rodney, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, in 1973, pointed to how Europe, through centuries of the export slave trade and the imposition of colonial rule in Africa, had stunted Africa's growth, celebrated and dismissed for its polemic tone. These arguments were reiterated in a more somber tone by the Nigerian economic historian Joseph Inikuri in The Chaining of a Continent, published in 1992. African slavery in the New World developed in tandem with the rise of capitalism. Patrick Manning, in Slavery and African Life, has discussed how African slavery emerged at a time when slavery was dying in Europe, how it intersected with modernity, and how slavery from the 16th century was defined as black, and the African slave as an agricultural slave. Eric Williams, a West Indian economic historian trained at Oxford, who became the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, wrote a landmark study of capitalism and slavery in 1944, examining the intimate links between British slavery and British capitalism. The structures of capitalism are historical. The institutions this history created are still with us. Capitalism and European colonialism were intimate bedfellows. In the early 1970s, a debate opened at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria between historian Jacob Ade Ajayi and the political scientist Peter Eke. For Ajayi, the historian who dealt with vast expanses of time, European colonialism lasted only for an episode, and Europe's impact on African history was limited. Eke disagreed, and he would write in 1975 that our post-colonial present has been fashioned by our colonial past. It is that colonial past that has defined for us the spheres of morality that have come to dominate our politics. For Eke, colonialism was an epoch, not an episode. Not only has colonialism left its legacies in Africa, the very nature of decolonization has shaped African politics. The decision of France between 1958 and 1960 to break up two federations in West Africa and Equatorial Africa and create 12 small, easy-to-control independent states, instead of leaving intact on independence the larger federations, as nationalists like Leopold Senghor had advocated for. The hasty retreat from Congo by Belgium plunged the country into a civil war that continues to color the history of the DRC. The short experiment at regional autonomy and federation in Nigeria between 1957 and 1960 did not prepare the country for the civil war that overtook the country from 1967 to 1970 with the secession of Biafra. And as Africa became independent, the first generation of independent African leaders had to wrestle with what to do with the inherited colonial boundaries. The political institutions like the nation state, which the veteran British journalist and historian Basil Davidson called the curse of Africa. Let us move on from this scholarly background to discuss how our past shapes inequities in present-day Africa. As an historian of Africa, I am perturbed that non-Africans seem to know more about our continent and its history than us. How many Africans today know how we came to be called Africans and our continent Africa, the name the Romans gave some 2 millennia ago to one of their 4 provinces in North Africa, which covered eastern Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripolitania? I often reflect on Biafra and its afterlives. The attempt to create an independent state of Biafra ended in 1970. I have taught at Harvard since 1993, and I've had the pleasure of teaching generations of Igbo students born in the United States. Several have written research papers about what they considered the injustice of Biafra, and I am struck by how younger Igbo, who were not born in Nigeria nor experienced Biafra, have inherited the moral pain of their parents. The question of moral pain is an important one. Apartheid ended in 1994, and South Africa has been led by the ANC since. Yet we have an entire population still going through trauma. The high levels of violence against women and children in South Africa cannot be divorced from its violent past. We cannot count the societies across Africa wrestling with the moral pain of past injustices. These include many liberation movements that bore the brunt of colonial violence and the civil wars that have torn independent African countries apart. How do societies that have gone through violent pasts and moral pain find healing and paths to inclusive, prosperous futures? Huge disparities exist in development. Development in Africa has been urban-centered. In most African countries, as you drive away from the capital city, all signs of development disappear. Tarred roads, electric lights, pipe-borne water, hospitals. This reality has encouraged rural-urban migration, further impoverishing rural areas and creating large slums in cities for migrants struggling to find a foothold. What are the future prospects for children growing in remote villages or in slums like Kibera in Nairobi and Sodom and Gomorrah in Accra? The huge income and economic disparities in Africa have become glaring as we wrestle with COVID-19, the challenges of lockdown, our incapacity to practice quarantine, and social distancing. African independence has been unkind to the countryside and to many marginal constituencies in the city. How do we make the dream and the expectations of independence an inclusive one? Global blackness, a term that is gaining salience, is not just about race, but about how the global operation of racial capitalism and empire have created structures and systems that have disadvantaged and discriminated against people of color the world over. That is why the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis can set alight a global protest movement picked up in Europe, Asia, and in African countries like Tunisia, where black marginalized Tunisians also seek to remind their society and government that black lives matter. And if you are a first-generation American with African-born parents or an African immigrant, the police only know that you are black. When New York City police shot and killed Guinean immigrant Amadou Diallo in front of his Bronx apartment in February 1999, they only saw a black man, not an African American, Caribbean, or African. In the increased mobility of a global world, Africans have become socialized into blackness by experience and by media. Issues to do with race and identity that I believed were American have become global. Africans deal with the harsh reality of race, not just in the West, but also in places like China. And race remains pertinent in North Africa and Southern Africa. How do we in Africa deal with the reality of race and its divisiveness? I end by proposing 3 areas to explore as we seek healing from our past and to address the inequities we live with today. Since I am an educator, my focus will be on education and healing our past through knowledge. The first relates to the structures of formal education and the importance of history in school curricula. We cannot afford to be ignorant of our past. Our knowledge of history is crucial to our sense of identity, our understanding of the institutions around us, and of our material and immaterial resources for building a brighter future. It enables us to avoid the mistakes of the past and to make amends for the inequities we have inherited from the past. Second is the importance of the creative arts. For millions of Europeans and North Americans, their introduction to Africa was by reading a novel like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, or through African music or art. Today, Africans and non-Africans continue to learn about Africa through novels, music, and art. Young Africans express their identity and find careers in the creative arts. I read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun and Yao Jessie's Homecoming through the recommendation of white American friends. The creative arts have become a bridge for young Africans in Africa and the diaspora as they seek usable paths. Third is social media, an avenue I confess I don't know much about but value very much. The Arab Spring cannot be discussed without reference in social media. The Arab Spring was sparked in Tunisia in December 2010 when the young rural Tunisian selling fruit in the city set himself on fire in protest against municipal officials seizing his goods and humiliating him. The result was the conflagration that swept through North Africa as youth mobilized through social media, gathered in protest against corrupt governments and the general lack of social and economic opportunities. Presidents of powerful countries have opted for Twitter as their choice of communication with their following. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, would have to be part of any serious effort to enlighten young Africans about the past, considering that 70% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa are under 30 years. Thank you.